The night my wife told me she'd found her soulmate, I smiled, picked up my phone, and texted my lawyer 4 simple instructions: close her credit lines, stop covering her father's medical bills, and remove her from the property deed immediately. She thought I was going to beg her to stay. Instead, I was already 3 steps ahead of her, and by the time she realized what those 4 sentences actually meant, it was far too late to undo any of it. My name is Marcus Webb, and this is the story of the 12 years I spent building a life with a woman who thought love meant nothing until the exact moment she needed my money to keep hers afloat. I met my wife, Sandra, when I was 26 years old, working long hours at a small logistics startup that, at the time, barely had enough money to cover payroll some months. Sandra was a nurse, kind, grounded, someone who never once made me feel small for the years I spent building that company from almost nothing. We got married when I was 29. For the first several years of our marriage, we lived modestly, and honestly, those were some of the best years of my life, the two of us figuring things out together, celebrating small wins like landing a new client or finally being able to afford a proper vacation. The company I helped build eventually grew into something much bigger than either of us imagined it could, a regional logistics and freight coordination firm that, by our 10th wedding anniversary, had made me genuinely wealthy, the kind of wealthy where money stopped being something you worried about and started being something other people worried about around you. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for the rest of this story. I never changed how I treated Sandra because of that money. I still cooked dinner most nights I was home. I still drove her father to his medical appointments myself whenever I could, because her father, a proud, stubborn man named Walter, had developed a serious heart condition a few years into our marriage, and I quietly took on the full cost of his treatment without ever making it a big deal, because that's simply what you do for family. Somewhere around year 11 of our marriage, though, something in Sandra started to shift. I noticed it in small things at first, the way she'd talk about some of her wealthier friends with a strange kind of longing in her voice, the way she started spending more time at a yoga studio downtown that, as it turned out, catered almost exclusively to a very particular crowd of well-off, spiritually minded, clients. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was busy, honestly, running a company with over 200 employees doesn't leave a lot of room for suspicion, and I trusted her, the way you trust someone after over a decade of building a life together. The real shift happened after she started talking about a man named Julian, a wellness coach she'd met at that yoga studio, someone who apparently helped her reconnect with her authentic self. At first, I heard about him the way you hear about any new friend your spouse makes, in passing, over dinner, nothing alarming. But slowly, Julian's name started appearing more and more, in stories about her day, in weekend plans that suddenly required her to be somewhere without me, in a new kind of language she started using that frankly didn't sound like her at all, words like energy alignment, and emotional authenticity, phrases I don't think Sandra had used once in the previous 11 years I'd known her. I want to pause here and say, if you've ever watched someone you love slowly start speaking in a language that doesn't sound like their own anymore, borrowed words from someone new in their life, I think you already know exactly where this story is heading. And if this is already pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because trust me, what I discovered over the following weeks, and what I did about it, is the part of this story people message me about the most. I started paying closer attention, quietly, the way you learn to when something feels off but you don't yet have the language to explain why. I noticed Sandra's phone, once left carelessly around the house for over a decade, now stayed locked and close to her at all times. I noticed new purchases on our joint accounts, small at first, a few $100s here and there for what she described as wellness retreat deposits, then larger amounts, several $1,000s for something called an immersive healing intensive that, when I quietly looked it up myself, turned out to be a weekend retreat run personally by Julian himself, at a rate that made my logistics company's own conference budget look modest by comparison. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. Sandra sat me down one evening, unprompted, and told me, almost gently, like she was doing me a favor, that she'd found something with Julian that she'd never truly felt with me, 12 years of marriage aside. She used the word soulmate, actually said it out loud, told me Julian was different from anyone she'd ever met, that he was genuine, that money meant absolutely nothing to him, that being around him had taught her what real, uncomplicated love actually felt like. I sat there and listened to every word of it, and I want to be honest with you, part of me was heartbroken, genuinely, because whatever had changed in Sandra over that past year, some part of me still loved the woman I'd married at 29. But another part of me, the part that had spent over a decade building a business by paying very close attention to details other people overlooked, was already doing quiet math in my head while she spoke. I asked her one simple question once she finished. I asked her, if money truly meant nothing to Julian, why exactly had every single one of their retreats and intensives together cost several $1,000s a session, paid, every single time, from an account with my name on it. Sandra didn't have a good answer to that. She got defensive instead, told me I was being cynical, that I'd never understood real spiritual growth, that this was exactly the kind of materialistic thinking Julian had helped her move beyond. That night, once Sandra had gone to stay at her sister's place to process everything, I did some digging of my own, the kind of digging 12 years of quiet observation and a career built on due diligence had trained me well for. It didn't take long to find that Julian, the supposedly money-indifferent soulmate, had, over just the past 18 months, run at least 3 separate wellness businesses that had each folded under mounting debt, each one, coincidentally, right around the time he'd found a new, financially comfortable partner to fund his healing work. Sandra wasn't his soulmate. She was, as far as I could piece together, simply the next in a fairly consistent pattern. I didn't confront Sandra with this immediately. I want to explain why, because I know some people would have rushed straight to her with the evidence, hoping it would snap her out of it. But I'd already made a decision that night, sitting alone in a house that suddenly felt a lot bigger and quieter than it used to. Whatever Sandra chose to believe about Julian, about our marriage, about what she thought love was supposed to feel like, that was ultimately her decision to make. But I was no longer going to be the quiet financial foundation underneath a life that had already, emotionally, moved on without me. The next morning, I called my attorney, a sharp, methodical woman named Denise Okafor who had handled the company's legal matters for years and, as it turned out, personal matters too when needed. I gave her 4 instructions, calmly, clearly. Close the joint credit line Sandra had access to, effective immediately. Pause, not cancel, but formally pause my direct coverage of her father Walter's ongoing medical expenses, transitioning the responsibility properly through his own insurance and a payment plan, since legally that arrangement had only ever existed as a personal favor from me, never a binding obligation. Begin the formal process of removing Sandra from the deed of our primary residence, a property that, importantly, I had purchased 2 years before we even met, and which had only had her name added, informally and without full legal transfer, as a gesture of trust early in our marriage. And finally, prepare the paperwork for a formal separation, since Sandra herself had made it fairly clear, in her own words, where her heart currently belonged. I want to be honest about something here, because I know this part might sound harsh to some of you listening. I did not do this out of pure spite or petty revenge, even though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I did it because I finally understood something clearly that night, something I probably should have understood much sooner. For 12 years, I had quietly absorbed the financial weight of our entire life together, her father's medical bills, the house, the comfortable lifestyle she'd grown used to, and somewhere along the way, Sandra had started to see that support not as an act of love, but simply as background infrastructure, something that would obviously always just be there no matter what choices she made, no matter who she decided to fall in love with next. Sandra found out about the changes 3 days later, when a routine grocery purchase declined at the checkout counter, her card no longer linked to an account she suddenly no longer had access to. She called me immediately, furious, accused me of trying to punish her, of proving I never really loved her at all if I could cut her off so quickly. I remember staying remarkably calm on that call, calmer than I expected myself to be, and I simply told her that if Julian was truly her soulmate, if money truly meant nothing to someone who genuinely loved her, then I was confident she'd found exactly the kind of unconditional support she was looking for, just not from me anymore. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you sticking with me, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe now, because the next part, what happened to Sandra and Julian over the following months, is honestly a twist I didn't see coming myself, even after everything. Here's where things took a turn I genuinely hadn't anticipated. About 6 weeks after I'd made those changes, I learned through a mutual friend, almost by accident, that Julian had abruptly ended things with Sandra the very same week her access to my accounts had been cut off. Not gradually. Not with some gentle, spiritually worded explanation about growth and letting go. Just gone, stopped answering her calls entirely, blocked her on every platform, moved on, from what I later heard, to someone new within a matter of weeks, a woman whose family, notably, owned a chain of medical supply companies. I won't pretend I felt nothing hearing that. There was a part of me that felt a quiet, uncomfortable kind of vindication, watching a pattern I'd suspected all along play out exactly as predicted. But mostly, honestly, I just felt tired, and a little sad, for the woman I used to know before all of this, the version of Sandra who used to laugh easily and never once cared about money in either direction, before something in her life shifted toward chasing a version of love that turned out to be nothing more than a very convincing performance. Sandra reached out to me twice after that, once asking, carefully, cautiously, whether there was any chance of us working things out, now that Julian was fully out of the picture. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that 12 years of marriage deserved more honesty than that, and that I wasn't interested in being someone's fallback plan after their soulmate turned out to only be interested in soul-deep bank accounts. It wasn't an easy thing to say. Some part of me, even after everything, still cared about her well-being, which is exactly why I made sure, through my attorney, that her father Walter's medical care transitioned smoothly onto a sustainable long-term plan, properly structured through his own coverage and a modest trust fund set up specifically for his ongoing treatment, separate entirely from anything involving Sandra, because whatever had happened between us, Walter had never done anything except treat me kindly for over a decade. And I wasn't going to let a broken marriage take that away from him. The divorce finalized about 8 months after that dinner table conversation where Sandra first told me about her soulmate. I kept the house, cleanly, legally, exactly as it always should have been. I kept the company I'd spent over a decade building. And honestly, I kept something else too, a very clear, hard-earned understanding of the difference between people who love you and people who simply love the life your effort makes possible for them. I think about that conversation sometimes, the one where Sandra sat across from me and said money meant nothing to Julian, completely unaware that within 2 months, that same man would vanish the moment the money attached to her actually stopped flowing. I don't say that to sound bitter, because honestly, I've made peace with all of it. I learned, the hard way, that real love doesn't disappear the second the financial support behind it does, and I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is stop being the quiet, invisible foundation holding up someone else's fantasy of a life they never actually had to build themselves. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Pay attention when someone tells you, plainly, in their own words, exactly who they are and what they value, because Sandra told me the truth that night at dinner, even if she didn't realize it herself, she just didn't expect me to believe her quite so quickly, or to act on it quite so decisively. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming, honest, real, and sometimes surprising in ways you won't expect. Thank you for listening to mine.